Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we're going to have a special episode in the sense that we're talking about resources for historians of astrology. So we're here with Philip Graves, who is welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Philip is an independent researcher on the history of astrology and has gathered a vast collection of books, of astrology books, particular books on the 19th century forward. So he has quite a collection of modern editions of books that can be used for someone researching in that period and the changes of astrology and the role of astrology in that period. So again, welcome.
Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
And let us know a little bit about yourself and the project that you have engaged into.
Right. Well, it really began almost by accident. I started studying astrology as a kind of casual interest while I was a university undergraduate studying French, and it developed from there as I started to look for more sources using the bibliographies at the backs of the books I'd already bought. I realized there was this vast history in the subject, and there were a number of reprints being produced in those days by publishers such as Isella and Ballantrae Reprint, and also obviously there was Project Hindsight, which was active. So there was a great interest and fascination for me in researching the history of the subject from then onwards. And initially, because of limited means, I did only collect late 20th century printings, albeit including reprints of earlier works. But I then branched out into the earlier printings, sort of to begin with early 20th century, and then going back to the 19th, and eventually even to the 17th, and a few in the 16th, when I had the means to do so, which was in the 2000s.
Okay. So when was it? Was it in the 80s or the 90s?
It began in the 1990s. I think I bought my first book on astrology in very early 1996, having previously received 3 as gifts the previous year. So.
And how many books do you have at this point? I was really curious about this.
That's a very good question. I think if you take the count of what I call edition volumes, which are unique volumes within a unique edition, as distinct from total number of copies, because there are some duplicates as a result of lots being purchased and donations and that sort of thing. I currently have just over 8,000 edition volumes of books and pamphlets that are not periodical in nature, and where periodicals are concerned, just over 12,000 unique issues of magazines and almanacs.
Wow, that's quite impressive. And which one is for you the most, well, they are all valuable, of course, but the one, or are there one or
you have
a group,
your crown jewel?
Yes, your crown jewel.
I wouldn't say I really had a crown jewel. I was very pleased to get an original edition of Jean-Baptiste Morin's Astrologia Gallica in the original Latin at auction when I had the means to do that, which was a sort of transient period of my life, so I certainly am very grateful for that, because it's just lovely when there have been all these translations of books here and there to have the whole Latin folio and to be able to see the early books which haven't been translated because they're not so astrological in theme and so on.
Oh, that's great. Original more. And what about the earliest publications that you have?
Well, the earliest printed ones are roughly 1550. I think I have a miniature edition of Claude Garland's book on I can't remember what it's called now, but it's related to medical astrology. And that was quite a popular printing in the 16th century, and so they're not actually as expensive as you might expect. I think it was just a few hundred euros, which for books of that era on astrology actually is quite reasonable. But I also actually have a 16th century printing with me, but this is a later 16th century one, and this is Heinrich Rantzau's Tractatus Astrologicus.
Yeah.
And this is the 1594 edition, which was the second overall edition and the definitive edition in terms of content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it was the basis of later reprints. So that's quite a pleasing thing to have, because it was widely reprinted in the early 17th century as well.
Does it have diagrams or text only? How is it?
It's mostly actually solid Latin text. I can just
Yeah.
Yeah.
open an
Typical.
example there.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So,
Well, it was very difficult then to include like a horoscope or any kind of diagram or table. It was really difficult.
I think Jerome Cardan, or Girolamo Cardano, as he's probably more formally known, some of his books do have quite extensive natal diagrams in them, and there are other examples as well from the 16th century.
But that would make the book more expensive, because it was kind of a physical process to put all the typos together. So that's really, I know what you're talking about. Cardan has a collection of horoscopes, and that would be something for the printer. That would be a challenge.
Oh, I'm sure it was a huge labour of love, a lot of these volumes to produce in the first place. And I imagine that the market for them must have been quite slight and limited to a fairly select group of people who had the means to afford them at that stage.
Yeah, that's true. And so although we do find, sometimes I'm surprised of the amount of circulation that some of these books had, because we think, well, this is an expensive item, of course, and it's not affordable to everyone. But I think most of them circulated in noblemen's or convents or churches, libraries, college libraries, which would have the means to afford them. So usually they come from them.
It's really interesting to look on WorldCat and other library records, and you can actually see that even the most prized and sought after 16th century and 17th century astrology books are actually quite widespread in terms of the holdings that are found at libraries now. I suppose the libraries have had centuries to take requests and so on. So in some ways, the irony is that books of that era are more common in academic and public libraries than minor works of the 20th century are.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, and probably, and that's one of my next questions. So probably you have in your collection books, more recent books and pamphlets that probably are very rare and are not widely available in any common library, I suppose.
That's true. Usually when I am looking at books which have been listed online on various bookselling sites, I will investigate their rarity in libraries as part of my determination of whether the asking price is reasonable or not. And quite often booksellers are actually pretty naive, and they will ask too much for something just because it's scarce, but actually there isn't the demand for to justify those prices. So one does have to be selective and to pass by some books that are literally overpriced. But at the same time, one does find that there are some 20th century editions that are not held in any library at all in the United States or in the UK, if they're, for example, English language titles, which is WorldCat would be the obvious place to go to for those. And in those cases, it's very gratifying to acquire books of that kind, because then you kind of feel you're doing a bit for conserving that bit of astrological history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and probably a few decades or even centuries onwards, there will be difficulty in finding some of the books that have been ignored in this process. I was thinking of a case that you probably are familiar with, the famous German collection of magazines, what's it called, the Zenit, which I've heard that there are very few complete collections of those magazines. There's one in Germany, I think.
In Germany, they were almost...
They were destroyed.
You mean Hubert Korsch's publications in it from the 1930s?
Yes.
Okay, well, I have the majority of those from the 1930s. I think it ran from 1930 to 1938. What I don't have is the relaunch from the 1950s. Now, that really is difficult to get hold of at the moment. I imagine that it's partly a result of the the market for astrology having shrunken during the Second World War. So there are a lot of 1950s publications which are actually more scarce than those in the 1930s, I'm finding. But I would say the 1930s ones are definitely the ones that are most in demand, because a lot of famous astrologers were writing articles at that stage. So actually, when I started collecting German books, Zenit was one of the first things I went after, but I still haven't completed it. So.
Yeah. I think that's what I've heard from German scholars, that there are little more than two complete known collections of the magazines.
One of them is at the Warburg.
One it's the Warburgs, I think, and the other one is
that's the one I saw at the Warburg.
In one of the libraries in Germany. I don't recall exactly which one, but it was a private donation to the library. Someone who managed to keep this private collection, so it wasn't affected by any purge or political changes at the time. So it's quite interesting. And in this regard, which one is, well, it's difficult to answer this, but the rarest books that you have at this point, the ones that you consider that are really hard to find, and you managed to get them?
I would say some of the very early American books that were distributed to a fairly narrow circle of enthusiasts and cheaply printed, they've had a poor survival rate. So, for instance, there was an American astrologer called Frederick White, who you don't tend to read about in the general histories of astrology much, unless you read James Herschel Holden, who of course has catalogued pretty much everything that's been produced in the United States. But general histories, you don't tend to find his name mentioned. But he edited what was actually at the time the longest running American astrological magazine of the early 20th century, called The Adept. The title doesn't even mention astrology in the main title, but the subtitle does. So I've collected, it was a monthly, I think, from 1898 to 1921. And I've so far collected about 105 original issues, and so I'm still missing over half of them. That's how difficult it is to collect. And he also wrote some short books, one of which was one of the early books that took after. In the late 19th century, there was a movement to redevelop heliocentric astrology, and he wrote a book called Heliocentric Astrology, and that one I have not found for sale at all. There is a scan at an American library online, which is free to download, fortunately, so it isn't lost. But he also wrote a companion book called Geocentric Astrology, and that one's extremely rare. I've seen just one copy for sale, and I bought it. So.
That is interesting. I never saw that.
There's a lot of things that are forgotten. I think that's the problem. Completely forgotten from the early 20th century history, which is just around the corner. For us,
I must say, both those two books were from 1896. It was the very end of the 19th century before he started his magazine.
Yeah. No, that's quite interesting, and I think you're doing a very good work in collecting this and making this available to a future researcher, because I think it's going to be valuable. And this is something, of course, that gets valuable as the time passes, because these books getting rarer and rarer, and then at least they are preserved.
And also, I think that you have to be sufficiently outside an historical period for it to become of sufficient interest to historians to become the focus of an academic study as well. I would say that to date, most of the effort that's been expended on studying the history of astrology has been limited to books up to and including the end of the 17th century. There's been comparatively little in any period since then. A small number of academic works, such as those by Patrick Curry, that have focused in detail on a selective range of authors from the 19th century, but even they haven't been at all comprehensive. So actually there's a vast area of history, of modern astrological history, that hasn't really been studied properly academically yet, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you. That we do have those studies from, I would say, the Anglophone areas, but very little everywhere else.
That's right.
Yes, I can say that because I'm currently working throughout the 17th century. So when I reach the 18th century, we start to lose the picture, because you do not have deep, in-depth academic studies on what happened, what exactly happens with astrology at that point. We just have a scattered history that suddenly
Absolutely.
pop ups in the late 19th century, the esoteric movements, but you don't really know what's happening. Yeah.
That's very true, and I also think that there has been a certain amount of ignorance of the course that astrology took between the 17th century and the 19th as well. And there's been a tendency to simplify things and say, well, actually, astrology died out in Europe, but it didn't completely die out. I mean, if you actually look in British library records or on WorldCat, you will see there were assorted publications occurring here and there, not only almanacs, but actual books. So, for instance, in 1726, there was a new astrological textbook by Samuel Pensaer called A New Guide to Astrology, and that doesn't get talked about much. And from 1750 onwards, there's actually a scattering of astrological books which aren't almanacs appearing before the great Sibley work of 1784 to 1788. So, in fact, definitely more research does need to be done into that, I think.
Yes, and worldwide, I would think,
Yes.
because we do have the English world more or less, well, poorly accounted from what we are saying here, and the rest is almost a blank.
That's true. Yeah.
What's happening in France, what's happening in Italy, which had a long history of astrological practice. Germany has a long history of astrological practice, as we see by the resurgence that we have in the early 20th century. So, there are all the other countries. What is happening? Even here in Portugal, we have very, very little data about this, and we know that we had a very active astrological community, at least in discussion, in the early decades of the 20th century. Even one of our famous poets, Fernando Pessoa, was a dedicated astrologer, and he was studying, and there was a group of people of which we have no idea who they were exactly, what were they producing, because no research has ever been done.
There's a book.
There's a couple of books, yes.
Yes, and apparently this poet, Fernando Pessoa, had a direct contact and I think a friendship with Aleister Crowley. So there was this, there was this kind of circulation
of information. Yes.
Oh well, absolutely. I mean, one thing I've noticed by collecting periodicals has been the degree to which the astrological community was connected internationally, really from the late 19th century onwards, and even in the mid 19th century, we see examples. For instance, with Luke, I don't know if it's Broughton or Broughton, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, but he's one of the leading American astrologers of the mid to late 19th century, and he corresponded with Zadkiel, Richard Morrison, who was the editor of Zadkiel's Almanac and one of the major names of mid 19th century British astrology. So there was a lot of interest in communicating across national boundaries even before it was cheap and easy to actually travel to those places. There was a postal service, so
yes, there was a lot of correspondence going on.
That is actually in line with the tradition of astrology, because medievalists like me, when we study the Middle Ages, we always give astrology as an example of intercultural discussions or scientific debates between Christians, Muslims, and Jews.
Yes.
And in different countries. So they were like using this knowledge, the knowledge of the stars, as a basis. And it doesn't mean that they didn't have their differences, sometimes really difficult situations between different religions, but they were like these men of science, and they were mainly men. They were like transcending that and debating that. And it's interesting to see that even in the 19th century and then early and probably 18th century, I think this is something that we don't have much documentation about it, but probably remained and adapted to the new time.
I can give you a 17th century example. Jean-Baptiste Morin, for example, had a widely corresponding network with several astrologers, even some from the New World, which he partially published. So it's very interesting, and I have no idea if those documents still exist, which would be wonderful to look at and see what they were.
I think it's a basic problem for historians of any period, really, reading beyond the available surviving documentation and trying to understand what's going on in the background. And so, for instance, when you get to the revival of astrology that in print form that really took off in the late 18th century and continued to gather momentum in the 19th. You can see evidence in the magazines that were being published in the very late 18th and early 19th centuries that actually there was still a fairly vibrant community of people who were studying the older texts at this time, and they would write in letters and say this and that in quite learned terms about books that they knew from the 17th century. So, and we also know, for instance, that one of Placido de Titus's great books of the 17th century, the Tabulae. I can't remember the full name now because it's not written down in front of me, but one of his two major natal works anyway, that was privately translated by somebody as a job for the owner of an original copy of the Latin edition, and that was quite an undertaking. And this then became the basis of all the English translations that were then published in the very late 18th and early 19th century.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, and this brings us back to your collection and the importance of your collection and private collections for academic research, because probably a researcher of these periods would find in sources that are not in any other. There are nowhere to be found except probably in your collection. So this is kind of.
Yeah, and then while collecting, you're automatically making a list of available sources. And
that's true. Yes, I'm gathering research, and I'm noting down mentally or even in actual notes sources which, if I was able to find them for sale, I would want to add to the collection at a later date. So it's an ongoing process. And I would say that in addition to there being some sources that are very difficult to find anywhere in a public library, there are also many that are scattered across so many different libraries that from a practical point of view there's a huge advantage to researchers in having a lot of sources relevant to one subject under a single roof. And so that's another reason I wanted to have a collection that covers as wide a ground as possible historically and internationally in terms of the different languages that are represented in it. Actually, at some point, you mentioned I should bring a few books up. I've got a few examples of books written in different languages beyond Ransau, which obviously is Latin. So I wondered if it would be a good time just to show a few up to the camera. Okay. Particularly from thinking of you both, I've got something here which is actually in Portuguese. This is Brazilian Portuguese. And this is an early... Can you see a little bit closer?
Let me see.
Let me get my glasses.
I don't know if the focus is any
Augusta Faria.
Augusta Faria, yes.
Astronomia, astrology. Oh, okay, I know.
Wow, interesting.
What is it? Yes.
So this is...
More like your period, not my... Yes.
This was published apparently in Brazil.
I see, very interesting. Augusta Faria, is it the editor or the author?
What date is that one?
It's, I think, around 1930s, very early 1930s maybe. Let's have a check. Sorry, no, 1937.
Okay.
Interesting.
I've heard about it, but I have never actually seen a copy of it. That's quite.
And what is it inside? Is it just a book for learning astrology, or is it like more?
It's very difficult because I don't have good Portuguese. I mean, I did literally 1 year of Spanish at university, and obviously Portuguese looks similar to Spanish, but it does have differences. And my Spanish is very basic, so I was really hoping that might be something which one of you could could help with at some stage. It's a little bit of an enigma for me at the moment, I must say.
Can you put it a little bit closer?
It's difficult.
Yeah, so I'll try and find a page that appears to be... Okay, here I've got Planetas e Signos.
Planetas and signos, yes. The planets in the signs, of course.
Well, yes.
So it's doctrine.
Okay, it's probably a manual.
Yeah.
Okay,
what we can see, if you can take a photo or print of the index, and then we can translate the index for you.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thank you. That would be great help. So that was just an example of a work in Portuguese. This is an American work. Now, it's a strange-looking cover. says Evolutional Astrology by Figurist. Now, you might wonder who Figurist is if you don't already know. It was actually the pen name of Mark Edmund Jones, who was one of the leading astrologers in America of the 20th century. And this book was published in 1916 in a limited edition, and it was actually related to, I think, a Rosicrucian Society of America.
But he had the yin yang, so interesting.
Yeah, but very interesting. And the use of that name, evolutional astrology, is quite interesting as because
yes.
Well, we have all the evolutionary astrology appearing in the 1970s and onwards, so it's almost as though Jones was quite forward-thinking and anticipating a demand for something which would be expressed in such terms, albeit he had the ending slightly different from what was eventually used by others. But I think his actual concepts were pretty much entirely different from those that have been attached to the idea of evolutionary astrology since the 70s, but it's an interesting piece of history. And he was quite a young man, I think, at that time, because his lecture lessons, which I also have downstairs, he had, I think, 12 volumes of these lecture lessons on different branches of astrology. They were published in the late 1920s and early 1930s, which is over 10 years after this. I'll move on to something in German. This is the first issue of a publication related to one of the main astrological bodies in Austria. And this is from the 1950s.
Get my glasses?
Yeah.
Austria. Yes.
This was quite a long-running periodical. As I say, it started in the mid-50s. It carried on in fits and starts, and eventually changed its name to Qualität der Zeit, and it was still published under that name into the 1980s. So it's quite an interesting publication. There's a lot of serious articles in there. Really, I need visiting scholars who are expert in German. Again, it's not one of my strongest languages. My strongest languages, apart from English, are actually French and Swedish. I did a degree in French, and I studied Swedish in Sweden to an advanced level at a later date. But I took German only to GCSE, which is age 16. So I think that there are a lot of resources in German here, which would be great for a German expert to come and research at some stage. So
that would be very interesting. Yes.
Yes, for the Aster the project in which we are included, the Aster project is studying only until the 17th century, because we are working from the perspective of history of science.
Yes.
And from late 17th century onwards, astrology is no longer fitted in the history of science per se, although it has history of astrology. But we do think, as we were discussing earlier, that there is a whole modern history of astrology from 18th century onwards that still needs to be done and
needs to be written.
Yeah, as we need to understand the impact of astrology in earlier periods and the importance, the core importance that it had throughout our cultural history. We also need to understand exactly how that presence of astrology lingered on and continued after its downfall as a scientific explanation of the world, let us say. And I think that's where your library mostly comes into being, because you do have the resources for that.
What I would also say is that although in academia the history of science may not be considered to be something that really is something you can discuss where astrology is concerned beyond the end of the 17th century, in actual fact, astrologers of the early to mid 20th century, many of them took the scientific credentials of astrology and investigating it empirically extremely seriously. Although there was this one more esoteric branch that was popular, people who had joined the Theosophical societies coming into astrology that way, there were also people who were approaching astrology in a completely different manner, starting with Paul Schwarzenau, really, and continuing with Karl Ernst Kraft, Léon Lasson, and eventually Michel and Françoise Gauquelin. It was predominantly a French-speaking tradition in the early part of the 20th century, but there was this big statistical research movement, and that actually does, in my view, belong to the history of science, because it's scientific research, albeit in an area that is frowned upon by modern science.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That is why we are a bit restricted. I'm a medievalist, so I am
Yeah.
I can study whatever I want, but still I am mainly a medievalist, and I love it. But what we think should be done is that eventually, in time, astrology would become like a field of its own,
The history of astrology.
independent, the history of astrology,
Yeah.
independent of science or other things, because
Right.
there's a lot of good work regarding astrology from the perspective of sociology or other
Exactly.
areas.
Yeah.
But you
Cultural
always
art, yeah.
art history, but you
Yeah.
always approach astrology from some kind of angle, and seldom by itself.
Yes.
I mean, in
That's right.
academia. I mean, in
That's
academia.
true. Yes.
So
Yes.
probably what we need is to think in time of like a more independent field of study.
Which can then gather.
Everything.
It can be transversal in terms of timeline, and you could do the antiquity to the current.
Yeah.
So yes,
I'm sure you're aware there's already this concept of cultural astrology related to cultural astronomy, and that I think is fairly broad.
it
But
is.
perhaps there needs to be something even broader than that. So that's an open question.
Yeah.
It needs to be unapologetic.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of work to do that, and the problem with academic field studies is that they have to prove themselves.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Astrology as itself as an academic subject took almost a century to prove itself,
And still,
even so, and still today there
Yeah.
are some resistance to it, but
Yes.
it's completely different. So it takes time for these study fields to be introduced and to gain their own weight.
Yes, but I can give you a very practical example. Every time that we, both of us, have to present a lecture
Yes.
anywhere in the planet, we have to begin with this disclaimer, like, look, what we know of astrology today is different from what we are going to present. There's a big difference between, let's say, sun sign astrology and what we are going to present. And every single time we have to do something like this. Even when people say, like, yeah, thank you, we know this, but still, there's this need. And ideally, we will come to a point that this is not necessary. But
yes, I certainly agree with that. There is a lot of popular ignorance about what astrology truly encompasses. A lot of people, even people who are academics within scientific fields,
Absolutely.
who really have very, very little knowledge of the history of astrology or anything to do with it. Having said that, I would say overall, the place of astrology in academia has ostensibly improved within the last 30 years. There have been far more publications, far more serious academic studies, critical editions of source texts and that kind of thing. So in some ways, it's actually not academia which is lagging behind now, but it's popular consciousness and perhaps general understanding among people who have a scientific background in particular of what astrology really is about, because one constantly sees these straw man dismissals of astrology which are based on nothing but ignorance.
Absolutely, yes. But sometimes it's not even, it's easy to point the finger at people don't know, so they are, but sometimes it's even people who call themselves practitioners that are like cultivating this misinformation. So it is a difficult field. It is difficult, yes. So yeah,
that's something to be
it
solved.
is important to have these collections and to have this. And I'm really fascinated with the 17th to 20th century period, because there's so much yet to know.
I wanted to give just one more example of a book in a different language, and that is it's the first journals that were edited by Gustave Lambert Brahe, who was one of the leading Belgian astrologers of the 20th century. This is La Revue Belge d'Astrologie Moderne. So I'll just hold that up to the camera. That's the very first.
Astrologie Moderne. You can see the title very clearly, not the small letter.
Yeah.
What is the year? I cannot see it.
It was 1926.
December 26. Oh, great. Yes.
That's right. And that continued in print through to, it was one of the rare continental astrology magazines that survived the beginning of the Second World War. It was still in publication on and off until 1943, and then finally it did have to pause. So I don't know quite how they did that. There's a story behind that, but I need to remind myself that they managed to carry on when almost all the others had stopped. And I've collected pretty much all the pre-war and within the Second World War issues. So you get this fascinating interplay just around the late 1930s and early 1940s between astrological periodicals and politics, because obviously it was a time of great turbulence, particularly in Europe. And so I think that's another specialist area which really needs more study. And I've tried to collect as many as possible of the periodicals from that time period, partly for that reason.
Yeah.
The interest in the horoscopes of political leaders and events and everything. We can also see this in a very minute way in Lisbon.
Yes, once many years ago, we were trying to reconstruct what we could find of astrological practice of early 20th century here in Portugal, so we can have an historical idea of what was happening, and we couldn't finish that, but we did have access to the Theosophical Society's library at the time, and we did find that they would have
periodical astrological
meetings. I'm not sure if they were classes because no one really knew, and the records are confused. But we knew, and there was this.
There was this remark on 34, I think 1934. They had this meeting,
and then they were going to discuss. That's what they were saying. I'm paraphrasing, but they were going to talk about the chart of the new Chancellor of Germany, in which they had strong hopes for the future, and this is quite precious.
Well, that's ironic with hindsight, isn't it? Everything looks different with hindsight, but
it's very naive. But they were really, hopeful about it.
But it's interesting to see a practice that we will be seeing in every period of astrological practice, because you have that in antiquity, you have that in medieval times, and you have that especially in the early modern period, where you already have organized collections of famous nativities, and you see this practice and these needs to investigate with astrology the political events and the charts of the rulers and of the people in power.
And people really, and this is one thing that really fascinates me about astrology, whether it is mainstream or not, and sometimes it was even dangerous to be an astrologer or to practice. We see people that are completely passionate about it, and they feel, and they want to go about it scientifically, and they want to do it seriously, and that's very, very interesting. We find this in every period and in every country.
Yes, and that's very true, and I think it's one of the narratives about the history of modern astrology until recently, which I would dispute, and by the sound of it you would dispute too, Helena, has been that that there was high astrology until the mid-17th century, and then you had only low astrology, which was popularized form with almanacs and so on. But actually, when you look a bit deeper, there were these very serious intellectuals throughout the ages who were studying astrology as a serious discipline. And
I agree with you. I completely agree. Yes. Yeah, the thing is that the press made the almanacs very popular. So we have, they are more visible for us. It doesn't mean that there was not other kinds of practice. It's just that the almanacs are visible.
Yeah, and we have always the terrible tendency to simplify things a little bit. And what you call is what our the head of our department calls an unchallenged belief. So we have this assumption that this is what's happening, and no one has really challenged it. Is it really like this, or do we have a more complex picture? As we
that's one of the things I very much can relate to that you just said, because there are all these received histories of modern astrology and you can read them and get valuable insights from them, but they're not perfect. They were limited by the resources that were available to those historians at the time they wrote them, and for that reason, despite their best efforts, they do get some things wrong and make some assumptions which actually,
Yes. Yeah.
when you have access to a fuller range of primary source material, you can disprove. And I've been actually discovering several of the assumptions that were widely reproduced in 20th century histories of astrology to be at best inaccurate, at worst completely erroneous.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
And also, any historian, myself included, has bias. We have
Yes.
some sort of bias, either in favor or against. And for a long time, historians had to detach themselves from astrology. I mean, historians of astrology, and
Yes.
they would begin their books like, "I'm not an astrologer. This is like superstitious," and blah blah blah. And then they could not really give the texts the respect and the love that they need to
Yeah.
you know to be studied. And so this is something that we have to be aware of for ourselves as historians also, but
Yes.
this is something that we have to take into account when we
Yes.
read old books also. And well, there are a lot of
Yeah. And we always have
examples
to
of
have
that.
that openness to challenge our own
Our own beliefs.
beliefs and information, because with new data, so all of a sudden we can completely blow out an idea that we had already
Yeah.
solidified in us, and that's a
Yes.
big challenge as a researcher.
But for
Because,
historians, although that's kind of disheartening for a moment,
Yes.
it's great. It's something
Oh,
that we
yes.
found out.
It's exciting, the whole process of discovering bits
yeah.
of history which haven't really been written about or have been misunderstood or forgotten. And
Mhm.
I think it's very much the same satisfaction that archaeologists get when they
Mhm.
discover, for instance, evidence of ancient human species that have gone extinct, and the whole received history of the development of our species has been radically rewritten in the last 25 years.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's very
yeah,
exciting. And
yeah,
that's
it
one
is.
of the good parts of being an historian
Yeah.
or an anthropologist
A
Mm,
researcher,
or a
a researcher,
researcher in
yeah, it's
general.
the
yes.
And
challenges.
I thought, like, I would like to, I don't know, challenge you for one thing. Have you thought of writing a book?
I have actually. So far I've written mainly individual studies, articles, and in one case a lecture I presented at Perugia in Italy on very specific facets of the history of modern astrology. I do have enough material to compile into a book,
Mhm.
and I'm interested in getting that published, if not this year, certainly next. And I'll continue to work on articles. I haven't thought so much about a single book on a single historical theme yet,
Mhm.
because I find so many different little episodes and features and aspects of astrology individually and separately interesting. But I've reached about 100,000 words in my published articles so far, so I think that's enough for a small volume of
Very.
essays.
Yes, it
And
is.
you
It
don't
is.
have to restrict your book to one topic. It can be like, as you said, like a collection of articles
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, yes. It's also a
Yeah.
format that can work very
It
well.
works very well, especially you see the readers. Sometimes they can look, they can browse through the index and see like this is very interesting for me or
Yeah.
that is. So I'm completely in favor of collections of
Mhm.
articles.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
Well,
You're
there are a lot
correct.
of them in academia as well, a lot of academic presses that produce collections of previously disparately published articles by particular scholars. And even within the history of astrology, it's great to have those volumes in the library because you can get valuable resources that are widely cited just on the shelves that way. And obviously, increasingly, a lot of academic articles being posted online, but I would say that's far from comprehensive, so it's still good to have the published volumes if you can.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I was going to ask you two things related to what we're talking about. And do you also have, you have, of course, astrology source material. Do you also have studies on astrology? So does the
Absolutely.
library also collect?
Absolutely. I've collected as much as possible of the academic literature on astrology since the early 2000s, including second-hand volumes. There was a time in the 2000s when, because I had inherited a little bit of money from a couple of my grandmothers, that was when I really took off into getting the more expensive material, such as some 17th century printings and also the academic source text. And having started with the academic source text, I felt, well, I've got to do this properly now. So I have collected those in all modern European languages that, as far as possible, that have been available. Some of them are already out of print before I would be able to get a copy, and some of those are still very, very hard to get second hand. So I have to keep my eyes open for some from the 90s, for instance. I think it's also possible that the number of academics who've studied the history of astrology has increased since the 80s, since the 90s even, to the point that what was an adequate supply for academic libraries and for private scholars in the 90s is no longer an adequate supply of those books, and as a result they become ridiculously scarce and expensive to get hold of second hand. But I've done my best with that.
Okay. And what about digital resources? Do you also collect those? Do you have those are more difficult to
Yes, well, there's a small number of sources which I haven't been able to find in print form, but which have been made available as free scans from university libraries in the United States and public libraries in the United States. And so obviously I've downloaded those to my computer. I do try and collect physical sources as far as possible. I've also digitized quite an extensive range of out of copyright sources that are in English. I haven't done the Latin ones or any other languages yet. And made those available on DVD compilations. I did that several years ago, actually, when I was living in Sweden, and it was just a small business at the time. And so that really takes in the 17th century English works, the 19th century English and American works, and that's about it so far. Plus also more or less the complete run of the periodicals that were edited by Alan Leo, the Astrologers magazine and Modern Astrology. I compiled those onto 2 DVDs by scanning every single issue. So.
Yes. Well, it is a great collection.
Yeah, it is. And now I'm going to ask a crucial question that we have forgotten so far, which is, where is your library located, and how can people access it?
Okay, it's in a small city called Newport in southeast Wales in the United Kingdom, which fortunately has very good road and rail access. The M4, one of the leading motorways from London, goes right past, and there's the direct trains all the way through to London as well. So although it's in Wales, it's actually only 2.5 hours by train away. So it's really more convenient than you might think, and it's literally within a 20-minute walk from the central station of Newport. Now obviously we have a peculiar situation on our hands at the moment with the pandemic situation, so provisionally I am discouraging people from visiting this year. I would like to wait until it's clearly safe and people don't have to worry about infection and masks and things like that. So probably it will be next year before I actually open to visitors again.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
And if one wants to visit and wants to go to Ireland, when you reopen safely, you just have to contact you through your website, which I'll leave in the description.
Exactly, and it would be helpful to have a little bit of background on your research interests. If you're tenured academically, that would be good to know about what your position is. If not, then what your private research interests may be. Obviously, I need to just really understand what your needs are so that I can prepare in terms of having the sources ready for your visit. There are 2 nice pine reading tables, so I can actually, one in each of the larger library rooms downstairs, so I can actually get sources ready in advance of a visit, so you don't have to kind of search all the shelves for them and waste time when you could be doing research of your own.
Great. Okay. Great. And you have an online catalog, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, yes. The catalog, it's quite a bit of work, but I've got an offline version, and then every time I make changes to that, I then edit the HTML pages accordingly so that it's pretty much entirely duplicated online at /astrology-bibliography within my domain name astrolearn.com.
Okay. Perfect. now we have all the technical important part also covered. Okay, great.
Okay, so I think
Well, yeah.
what we have to do is to thank you for all the effort, because I know
Yes.
how much, and not only in resources, but also in energy and emotional investment there is in a collection. So I think it is more than fair that we all thank you
Yeah.
for your effort and for this wonderful collection.
And I'm sure future researchers will also thank you.
Yeah, I am.
Well, thank you both for your kind words, and thank you very much again for inviting me on your podcast. It's been a great honor and a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. And well, we hope to see you perhaps another time when we have something to talk about, or there's a new book in your collection, new change. And who knows?
I look forward to that very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.